Now it's the turn of Mr. Mahfud Mohamed Lamin. Creo que habla español, me han dicho. ¿Nos va a poder hacer la presentación en español?
Sí.
Pues adelante, por favor.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. Respetadas y respetados representantes del Parlamento de Cataluña. Mi nombre es Mahfud Mohamed Bechri, soy activista saharaui y miembro de Western Sahara is Not for Sale, una plataforma impulsada por 123 organizaciones de los territorios ocupados, de los campamentos de refugiados y de la diáspora, y apoyada por 200 organizaciones internacionales. En Western Sahara is Not for Sale trabajamos para denunciar las inversiones de las empresas multinacionales en el Sáhara Occidental ocupado y realizamos campañas con el objetivo de visibilizar el expolio de recursos naturales que sucede sin el consentimiento de nuestro pueblo, el pueblo saharaui. En primer lugar, quisiera daros las gracias, obviamente, por invitarnos a comparecer para hablar de este tema tan trascendental para el pueblo saharaui. Esta comisión y este Parlamento nos han acogido en varias oportunidades y conocen bastante bien la situación de vulneración de derechos humanos que sucede en el Sáhara Occidental ocupado. En segundo lugar, permitidme hacer un breve repaso con datos históricos sobre el Sáhara Occidental, especialmente para aquellos que no están muy familiarizados con la temática. El Sáhara Occidental es considerado por la ONU un territorio no autónomo pendiente de descolonización. De hecho, es el último territorio de África que sigue bajo ocupación y del cual España sigue siendo la potencia administradora, después de su vergonzosa retirada en 1975. Esta retirada dio comienzo a una guerra entre el Sáhara Occidental y los dos países vecinos que en su momento anexionaron el territorio, Marruecos y Mauritania. Con la retirada de Mauritania en 1979, un 80% del territorio saharaui pasó a estar bajo ocupación del Reino de Marruecos. Tras 16 años de guerra, la ONU intervino y logró un acuerdo entre las partes en conflicto, el Reino de Marruecos y el Frente Polisario. El acuerdo, firmado en 1991, consistía en un alto al fuego y la celebración de un referéndum de autodeterminación, en el que el pueblo saharaui pudiese votar entre un Estado independiente o la integración dentro del territorio de Marruecos. Para ello, la ONU desplegó una misión de cascos azules conocida como la MINURSO, cuyo único objetivo es garantizar la celebración del referéndum. Tristemente, este referéndum el Consejo de Seguridad de las Naciones Unidas, principalmente Francia, Estados Unidos y por supuesto,
señor Mahfud.
España.
Hemos perdido los últimos 30 segundos que hablaba usted del referéndum, lo hemos perdido. Y si se puede acercar un poco más al micrófono, porque no le oímos suficientemente bien. ¿Hola?
¿Me escuchan ahora?
Sí.
Este referéndum nunca se ha llegado a celebrar a causa de los continuos obstáculos que Marruecos ha puesto en el camino y el apoyo de sus aliados en el seno del Consejo de Seguridad de las Naciones Unidas, principalmente Francia, Estados Unidos y, por supuesto, España. Después de casi 30 años de una paz frágil, los tambores de guerra han vuelto a sonar en el Sáhara Occidental. En noviembre de 2020, una unidad del ejército marroquí intervino contra un centenar de activistas saharauis que protestaban de forma no violenta contra la explotación de sus recursos naturales y su transporte hacia África a través de la brecha del Guerguerat, una brecha en el muro que divide el Sáhara Occidental en dos, en la zona del sur del Sáhara Occidental conocida como Guerguerat. La respuesta del Frente Polisario como representante legítimo del pueblo saharaui fue denunciar la agresión y la vulneración del acuerdo de alto el fuego como acto de autodefensa. Anunció la vuelta a la lucha armada. A partir de ese momento y desde hace ya 2 años se vive una nueva guerra en el Sáhara Occidental. Una guerra silenciada, denominada de baja intensidad, pero que sigue cobrando la vida tanto de militares como de civiles en los territorios liberados del Sáhara Occidental, y en la que Marruecos está usando material bélico avanzado, como los drones, para atacar territorios saharauis. No sé si se sigue escuchando bien.
Sí, sí, perfecto.
En los territorios ocupados del Sáhara Occidental, la situación ha visto un significante deterioro y se han intensificado las violaciones de derechos humanos contra la población civil y especialmente contra activistas y defensoras de derechos humanos. El informe Visibilizando el Sáhara Occidental de las ONGs catalanas ACAPS y Novac, realizado con el apoyo y el testimonio de activistas saharauis de las zonas ocupadas, recoge más de 160 vulneraciones desde noviembre de 2020 hasta noviembre de 2021. Casos de tortura, uso inapropiado de la fuerza, violaciones sexuales, así como detenciones arbitrarias, desapariciones forzosas, dispersión violenta de manifestaciones. Estos son algunas de las vulneraciones que recoge el informe y que han visto un incremento significativo desde que la guerra ha vuelto al Sáhara Occidental. Organizaciones internacionales como Amnistía Internacional y Human Rights Watch han denunciado en más de una ocasión la escalada de represión en las zonas ocupadas saharauis. En lo que concierne a los recursos naturales saharauis y las operaciones de las corporaciones, se destaca que los recursos naturales del Sáhara Occidental ocupado son objeto de saqueo permanente por parte de la potencia ocupante, porque su explotación se lleva a cabo sin el consentimiento legítimo del pueblo saharaui. Esto ya ha sido reiterado por distintas resoluciones de Naciones Unidas y por 4 sentencias del Tribunal de Justicia de la Unión Europea, el cual ha expresado que la Unión Europea no puede considerar ni al territorio ni a las aguas adyacentes al Sáhara Occidental dentro de los acuerdos comerciales agrícolas y pesqueros que se han firmado con el Reino de Marruecos. Los Estados miembros de la Unión Europea, guiados por las normas del derecho internacional y las resoluciones de la ONU, no reconocen formalmente la soberanía de Marruecos sobre el territorio del Sáhara Occidental en ningún documento, ni su jurisdicción sobre los territorios ocupados ni las aguas territoriales saharauis. Aún así, desde hace décadas, los acuerdos de la Unión Europea y Marruecos incluyen la explotación de los recursos naturales del Sáhara Occidental. Señorías, en esta línea, el Tribunal de Justicia de la Unión Europea ha ratificado en al menos 3 ocasiones que el territorio y las aguas del Sáhara Occidental no son parte de Marruecos y, por tanto, los acuerdos establecidos entre la Unión Europea y Marruecos no se pueden aplicar, según la sentencia del Tribunal de Justicia de la Unión Europea. Para que estos acuerdos fueran válidos, tendrían que cumplirse 2 condiciones principales. Primero, mencionar el Sáhara Occidental y después tener el consentimiento expreso del pueblo saharaui. A pesar de ello, tanto la UE, como institución basada en el respeto al derecho internacional y a los derechos humanos, como centenares de empresas europeas, siguen estableciendo acuerdos con Marruecos que implican el saqueo sistemático de los recursos naturales del Sáhara Occidental, en contra de la legalidad internacional y de las resoluciones del propio Tribunal de Justicia de la Unión Europea. En este sentido, respecto al sector pesquero, el Estado español sigue siendo uno de los principales mercados del pescado, por ejemplo, sardinas, caballas o jurel, cefalpodos provenientes del Sáhara Occidental. La llegada del pescado se hace sin un etiquetado detallado y correcto, lo que supone que los recursos del Sáhara Occidental se comercializan en los supermercados de todo el Estado, incluida Cataluña, con una etiqueta de falsa procedencia. Esto supone un engaño a las personas consumidoras y a la ciudadanía del Estado español. Un claro ejemplo de ello es el pulpo. Según el informe Los tentáculos de la ocupación elaborado por el Observatorio de Empresas y Derechos Humanos, el ODE, ACAPS, Novac y SUDS, solo un 6% del pulpo que se consume en el Estado español proviene de los caladeros de Galicia. En cambio, desde Dakhla, la saharaui, se explotan 9.000 toneladas de pulpo al año, que son etiquetados como pulpo marroquí. Por su parte, Se ha de tener en cuenta que el 83,7% del pescado que obtiene Marruecos para exportación proviene de Dakhla. Con los acuerdos de pesca entre la UE y el Reino de Marruecos, se ha autorizado la faena de 128 barcos de los países de la Unión, de los cuales 92 de estos son españoles. A respecto del pulpo proveniente del Sáhara Occidental ocupado, la trazabilidad de este producto es más fácil respecto de otras especies, ya que los únicos caladeros del pulpo de la zona FAO 34 están en las aguas adyacentes a la ciudad saharaui de Dakhla, por lo que más de la mitad del pulpo que se consume en el Estado español no es ni gallego ni es marroquí, es pulpo expoliado del Sáhara Occidental. Grandes empresas españolas como Viveros Merímaro Disquefa y plataformas comerciales como Lidl, Corte Inglés, Ametler y Mercadona están implicadas en esta comercialización ilícita. El pasado 22 de diciembre, nuestra plataforma Western Sahara is Not for Sale convocó concentraciones en varias ciudades del Estado español contra Mercadona y su comercialización con falso etiquetado de productos pesqueros saharauis. Otro sector clave para el expolio de recursos naturales del Sáhara Occidental es el de las energías renovables. Empresas españolas como Siemens Gamesa están implicadas en hacer el greenwashing a la ocupación militar marroquí del Sáhara Occidental a través de proyectos de energía renovable. 22 molinos de vientos de Siemens Gamesa proveen el 95% de la energía necesaria para la extracción, también ilegal, de las minas de fosfatos en el Sáhara Occidental. Esa energía ni siquiera es usada para suplir las necesidades de la población local. Los molinos de viento de Siemens Gamesa también proveen energía a la operación de plantas de cemento en territorio ocupado. Siemens Gamesa suministra para los parques eólicos Embajador y La Ayun, dos ciudades saharauis, además de administrar estos proyectos en un consorcio en el que están empresas propiedad del monarca Mohamed VI. Por su parte, la empresa General Electric Renewable Energy fue adjudicataria en 2021 del contrato de instalación de un parque eólico en territorio ocupado del Sáhara Occidental. El diseño de este parque eólico se está llevando a cabo en las instalaciones de General Electric Wind en el barrio de Poblenou de Barcelona. También podemos destacar las operaciones de ASEA Brown y Boveri ABB, una de las mayores empresas suizas. La multinacional forma parte de la lista de empresas que operan en el Sáhara Occidental después de obtener un contrato para la construcción de la subestación híbrida del parque eólico de Aftisat, cerca de Embajador ocupado, el cual se encuentra operativo desde 2008. En Europa, ABB mantiene relaciones comerciales con algunas de las empresas militares más grandes, como Dassault Systèmes, Safran, Fincantieri o Rheinmetall. Además de que también existen relaciones con el ejército español y británico. En el Estado español, ABB está representada por la sociedad ASEA, Brown Bovero S.A. y su plantilla es repartida en 5 centros de producción, uno de ellos en San Quirze del Vallès. En 2019, la división Power Grids se vendió a Hitachi y en esa venta se implica la gestión del proyecto llevado a cabo en el Sáhara Occidental. Varios activistas saharauis han denunciado la apropiación de tierras por parte de las fuerzas de ocupación y por algunas empresas para la realización de sus proyectos con licencias de la Administración de Ocupación. Esta apropiación de tierras y el consiguiente desplazamiento de la población local, así como el traslado de población colona a territorios ocupados, es una clara vulneración de la Cuarta Convención de Ginebra. La violación del derecho internacional y de derechos humanos y la contribución de las empresas en esas vulneraciones suele pasar con la total impunidad. Realmente no dejamos por fuera la acción de empresas de infraestructura cementera como Heidelberg Cements o Lafarge. Ambas operan en el Sáhara Occidental ocupado y generan productos de exportación. Según datos de la Unión Europea, el 11% de los productos cementeros que se usan en obras públicas provienen de Marruecos. Un reciente estudio sobre las cadenas de suministro del Ayuntamiento de Barcelona concluía que hasta el momento no existe la capacidad para diagnosticar cuánto de ese porcentaje de cemento de exportación desde Marruecos proviene de una situación de vulneración de derechos y cuánto de ese productos de construcción terminan siendo usados en obras públicas en Cataluña y Barcelona. Tanto Lavage como Heidelberg son empresas que operan en Cataluña. Por esto es que es tan relevante la creación de centros de derechos humanos y empresas como la que estamos hablando en Cataluña. Si bien este centro no podrá acabar con la impunidad estructural en el Sáhara Occidental, sí que puede visibilizar la situación de lo que ahí sucede y plantear sugerencias de política pública dentro de las competencias autonómicas de Cataluña. Y ojalá proveer de análisis de riesgos a las autoridades del propio Estado español para que rompan las cadenas de suministro que colaboran a una situación cómplice en la vulneración de derechos humanos que ejerce el Reino de Marruecos sobre los saharauis. Es urgente que haya una supervisión de las actividades de las empresas que operan en Cataluña o empresas catalanas en el Sáhara Occidental y vigilar su alineación con el total respeto a los derechos humanos. Asimismo, es urgente que estas empresas no tengan ninguna actividad en territorios ocupados, como el caso del Sáhara Occidental y de Palestina. Creemos que la creación de este centro puede contribuir para que las empresas tengan en cuenta la obligación de respetar los derechos humanos y estarán bajo supervisión y posible sanción administrativa en caso de violar ese derecho. Como activistas, recomendamos y llamamos a la creación del centro. También invitamos a otras comunidades a hacer lo mismo. Haremos presión para que este ejemplo se pueda seguir a nivel del Estado español y que los derechos humanos sean respetados y sean una prioridad para nuestras empresas. Muchísimas gracias por vuestra atención.
Muchas gracias, señor Mohamed Lamin. Now it's the time for Mr. Johannes Blankenbach, who is a US Western Europe Senior Researcher and Representative. Please, it's your time. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, dear President. Thank you very much for the invitation and for hearing me today. As you said, my name is Johannes Blankenbach, and I'm the EU Western Europe Research and Representative at the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. The Business and Human Rights Resource Center is an international NGO working with all stakeholders to advance human rights in business. Our headquarters is in London, United Kingdom, but we have legal entities in a number of other countries, including in Germany, where I am located, as well as a network of regional researchers in all world regions. We track the human rights impacts of more than 10,000 companies in more than 180 countries, and we make information available through our 10-language website. We produce our own briefings and human rights benchmarks of companies, and we document also the policy and regulatory developments in this field of business and human rights. And yeah, thanks again for having me today. I think the processing of a bill on the creation of the Catalan Center for Business and Human Rights is good news, is excellent news for the growing business and human rights movement in Europe and worldwide. And it's also good news, especially for rights holders negatively affected by Catalan companies or by companies investing or active in Catalonia. It's also an opportunity, I believe, for companies from the region to become more resilient and more fit for the future. And yeah, you may be surprised, but in our work, we experience that quite a few companies are actually in favor of legislation that mandates respect for human rights. When my organization was founded about 20 years ago, so 2002, I think, the idea and practice of business and human rights was still very new, still very nascent. The UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, facilitated by John Ruggie and adopted in 2011, were then a first milestone, I would say, while these principles did not create new international law. They clarified the different roles and responsibilities that states and companies have to address business impacts on human rights. You will all be very aware of the three pillars that the UN Guiding Principles are based on: the state's duty to protect human rights, the company's responsibility to respect human rights, and then third pillar is access to remedy for victims of human rights abuse. And as Maha also alluded to, this third pillar, remedy, has received less attention than the other two pillars, and a lot of people affected by corporate human rights abuse across the globe do not have access to remedy, neither judicial nor non-judicial. So I would therefore encourage you as parliamentarians to design the Catalan Center's complaint mechanism, which I was happy to read is there. So I would encourage you to design that complaint mechanism in a way that can also promote affected people's access to remedy and compensation for harms they suffered from corporate activity. So at least I think the question whether or not a company has provided effective remedy for harms it was involved in, that should be part of the assessment and evaluation of companies that is done by the center. Or ideally, the center would have the authority to directly require companies to provide remedy. The UN Guiding Principles, as you may all know, also introduced human rights due diligence as the key instrument through which companies can implement their responsibility to respect human rights in their own operations and in their global value chains. And I think it's important to note that human rights due diligence is not an end in itself. It's not a process to tick off, but it's a means. It's not an end in itself, but it's a means to an end, and the end is avoiding human rights harm. And I think for any institution that wants to evaluate companies' human rights practices, like the Catalan Center, it is very important to really focus on the quality of the measures that companies take, rather than looking only at formal corporate policies, at contractual clauses they would use, or at social audit certificates that companies may present, for instance. In our experience, social auditing can be very unreliable. There's a lot of cheating, conflict of interest, whereas responsible purchasing practices, for instance, where the global brands use realistic delivery times and have long-term supplier relationships and fair purchasing prices, those can be a very effective measures to improve conditions further down in the supply chain, better than doing a lot of audits that in the end do not reflect much of the reality. We also recommend that companies have to talk to rights holders on the ground and seriously engage with unions, with human rights defenders, with affected communities, rather than just commissioning auditors. And that stakeholder engagement, I think, is very important. And yeah, the center ideally should promote that. The UN Guiding Principles recommend that governments should consider a smart mix of measures, as you know, mandatory and voluntary, to foster business respect for human rights. And so far, this smart mix of measures to promote business respect has leaned heavily towards voluntary measures, such as guidance for companies, dialogue events, multi-stakeholder initiatives, etc. These measures can be important, but as you all know, company progress in implementing the corporate responsibility to respect human rights has been very slow. Human rights and environmental abuse is still a grim reality in the operations and value chains of companies, including European companies, including companies from Catalonia. And in some sectors, abuses have even increased in recent years during the pandemic, for instance, when factory workers were abandoned by international brands, canceling their orders, etc. We also track a lot of abuse, a lot of human rights abuse related to the green transition, so the transition towards zero carbon. And we have a transition minerals tracker that documents what kind of abuses, human rights abuses, are related to the mining of minerals important for the green transition, for instance. So what we would say is there needs to be a fast and a fair transition towards zero carbon. Otherwise, it's unsustainable if it doesn't respect human rights at the same time. My organization also reaches out to companies in specific cases when the company has not yet responded to an allegation of human rights abuse. And between 2020 and 2021, we approached European companies over 600 times in response to allegations of human rights or environmental abuse. And 500 of those cases occurred outside of Europe. And many more are unreported, of course. We depend on the news and reports we get from other NGOs. So many cases of human rights abuse are unreported. We also conduct or produce benchmarks, human rights benchmarks of companies, and those benchmarks also show very slow progress. Typically, there are a few leading companies, but the majority of companies lags behind. So, for instance, according to our latest Know the Chain benchmark, which assesses forced labor risks, nearly half of the global companies we benchmarked failed to disclose undertaking human rights risk assessment in their supply chain. So almost half of the companies we evaluated do not assess risks, human rights risks in their global supply chains on forced labor in this case. So against all this background, which may sound depressing, the current trend in Europe and globally to move towards binding legislation, binding laws to make corporate respect for human rights mandatory is an overdue and extremely important and welcome development. I think the Catalan Center can be considered one important building block and innovative step towards more mandatory instruments in this field. It is also very welcome that the Parliament supports the passing of a legally binding international instrument. And Yeah, I had a look at the draft bill. I think it is very good, for instance, promising that the Catalan Center can sanction companies which do not respond or inappropriately respond to investigation. It's an important feature that that measures also have teeth to create a true level playing field of good and effective practice. And again, there are also companies who support this idea that any legislation that is effective also needs these teeth and enforcement measures. Otherwise, it's not a proper level playing field, and maybe one company will take it seriously, but other companies will not take it seriously. So it's an important idea to have these sanctions and enforcement mechanism. It's also very welcome that the Catalan Center's one of the Catalan Center's purposes is regulatory innovation. As I mentioned, this is what is really needed in the business and human rights field. And as Maha also mentioned, there is currently at the EU level the debate on the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which will still take a while, and which is indeed at the risk of being, or which is already being watered down. So I think this an initiative like the Catalan Center is very welcome in promoting, fostering the debate, and maybe the Catalan Center can be one of the voices pushing for a strong EU law and for strong implementation of this EU law at the state and sub-state level, because every law is only as good as its implementation. And yeah, what we currently see in the EU negotiations is that even though the EU law is meant to build on and align with the UN guiding principles and OECD guidelines, there are these constant attempts to further water down the legislative drafts. So for instance, the EU Council of Member States has adopted a position where they basically exclude the financial sector or financial services from the law's scope, which is I think extremely unfortunate. It's only the Council's position. So right now it's the Parliament formulating its position, the EU Parliament, and then there will be trilogue negotiations. And yeah, I think, for instance, inclusion of financial sector is extremely important, and maybe the Catalan Center could be one of the voices pushing for this. There are other asks from CSOs in these debates around mandatory due diligence, mandatory measures. One is indeed the personal scope of those initiatives. As you know, the UN guiding principles say that every company has a responsibility to respect human rights, including SMEs. And of course, the complexity of measures that can be different according to the size of the company, according to the severity of its impacts, but every company has this responsibility. And I think Catalonia has many SMEs, so inclusion of SMEs, I think, in your in the evaluation and control measures of the center could be extremely helpful. What is also, I think, important to note is that a company's responsibility does not end with its operations, subsidiaries, and branches abroad, but it also extends to the company's supply and value chain, as you may well be aware of. So companies also have a responsibility to prevent, to end, and remedy abuse happening at the level of the supply and value chain, and including in the so-called downstream value chain, that is the harmful impacts that may occur through the use of the company's products or services by others. Yeah, the UNGPs again provide a lot of guidance on what is expected from companies in this regard and how this can be implemented. And I think it's very important also for the center to have this full supply or full value chain perspective. So it's not just the operations abroad; it's also how the company contributes to abuse in the supply chain. For instance, I mentioned in the beginning this example of very exploitative prices that the company pays to suppliers. I mean, that can be a strong contribution to human rights issues in the deeper levels of the supply chain. Stakeholder engagement, I mentioned, is an important aspect, and of course, access to remedy. At the EU level, the mechanism that is being discussed is civil liability, so the opportunity for victims of abuse to go to court and and seek justice in front of EU courts, which I think is extremely important, both as an avenue for remedy, but also as an incentive for companies to actually conduct effective due diligence and truly respect human rights in business. And conflict sensitivity is, of course, another important aspect that should be part of companies' practices in the human rights field. So yeah, to conclude, I mean, I don't know to what extent these ideas can be implemented by the center. I think, yeah, the center should have all this on its radar, and it's a great innovation and a glimpse of hope. It's also an enormous asset for the Catalonia region, in my view, to have such a center, and we need more centers that can do research, provide guidance, monitor companies, and promote legislative innovation to really set the incentives and clear signals to shift business away from the old model of externalizing social and environmental costs towards a better, more sustainable business model that delivers shared prosperity and climate security. And yeah, with this, I would like to conclude and thank you. Thank you again, and I'm open for any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Blankenbach. Now it's the turn of the parties. We are here today, 4 parties. So I'm going to give the word to, first of all, to the Socialist Group. ¿Tienes alguna pregunta, algún comentari?
No, gràcies. De totes maneres, havíem dit que escoltàvem atentament les compareixences, agrair-los molt sincerament les seves aportacions i en el nostre cas el diputat responsable que segueix aquesta ponència, que està malalt, doncs seguirà atentament a continuació les explicacions que ens han fet. Moltes gràcies.
Gràcies. She don't have any questions for you, only the thank you to all of you for your presentation. Now it's my turn. I'm Junts from Catalonia, which is Together from Catalonia. First of all, I want to thank you all the 3 presentations and explanations. I would ask you if all of you have read the text, the text that you have received, and I would ask you if you have any proposal to improvement about the text, because our job is to try to build the best test possible. So if you have any proposal, please be free to tell to us. To Mr. Blankenbach, due to your experience evaluating companies, I would like you to ask if you think that this text it's only the aim of the text is only to control the companies, but my group think that we have to include too some functions to help the companies, to promote, to train the companies about the human rights. So I ask you if you think that it could be useful to include in the text. Then you have talked about the SME companies. But I want to ask you if you think that it has to be the same treatment for the big companies and the SME, because it's not the same for the company to respond, to have a department to control that, or any people inside the company to control the human rights. So what is your experience, and if you think it has to be the same treatment or different treatment? If you think that it could be possible, it could be positive to have any kind of certificate of best practices relating to the human rights. And to the three, the last question, to Ms. Abdallah and Mr. Lamin, the last question is if you think that with this text it could be helpful for your cases, because we have heard about your problems, we solidarize with your problems, but if you think that this kind of law can really thank to your cause. These are all my questions. So I finished my explanation, and now it's the turn to the Vox Party. Señor Terradas.
Sí, muchas gracias, presidente. First of all, I'd like to thank you, the three speakers that came here today, for talking to us in the Catalan. I don't know where I have to look at because I see myself on TV. So, in any case, you have given us a very interesting speech. But I have to say that this project of law that we are discussing here today will have no incidence in any of these issues. So, but everyone here has very interesting projects to work at, but I have to say that we are a regional parliament, and in any case, the Catalan government or the Catalan institutions do not have the constitutional competence on foreign policy. So we think that this Catalan Center of Business and Human Rights will have no influence in any of these conflicts that you have talking to us here today. That's the reason that why our parliamentary group will not support this project of law. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Terradas. At the turn of the Left Party, Republican Left Party. Go on, please.
Gracias. I would like to thank you, all of you three, for your comments, and it has been so interesting having the opportunity to hear you. And I would like to say that we are also concerned about Palestine and the situation there. Human rights are being in a very difficult situation, and in fact, in this parliament, we have approved some resolution about Israel and Palestine, showing our support to Palestine. We understand how important is having a Catalan Center for Business and Human Rights. We have the opportunity to defend human rights around the world, to defend human rights in business. And of course, we have to take this opportunity and to lead that it's a big step. Y por último, al compañero que nos hablaba del Sáhara, comentarle que, de hecho, en este Parlamento, como ya comentaba, hay un intergrupo precisamente sobre el Sáhara, y yo misma participé en la última edición de la UCOCO, que se celebró el mes de diciembre en Berlín, que ya saben que tienen todo nuestro apoyo con el pueblo saharaui. That's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Señora Balsera. So now it's your time again. You have, all of you, maximum of 10 minutes to answer the questions or the comments that we have been asking to you. So first of all, Ms. Abdallah, please, it's your turn.
Thank you, and thank you for all of your feedback and comments to our interventions. I will start by your first questions, if we read the texts. Yes, I read the text, and I was equally impressed by the language that is used. Obviously, I read the English translation of it, but I found that substantively it is very promising, especially when it references situations of conflict and occupation and other issues like that. And it's also very much in harmony with what's going on at the international level when it comes to corporate accountability and business and human rights. It explicitly references the guiding principles and the legally binding instrument and so on. And that is really important because we also don't want to risk any confusion or any problems, let's say, if we do not abide by these international instruments and debates on the subject. Maybe some of the recommendations that I thought about while reading the text is the importance of trying to maintain as big of a scope as possible, in the sense of what kind of companies would be included, the identities of the companies as well, and so on. So it is not limited to a specific group of companies, because I think from the cases that we presented today, it is very obvious that the size, nationalities, structure of these companies that are involved in violations extraterritorially, but with links to the Spanish state and to Catalonia specifically, they vary from one to the other. So ideally, the instrument or the center could accommodate all these varying characters and structures of these companies. As for your something else that I was thinking about as well is having an explicit reference in the bill about indigenous peoples' rights, about the right to self-determination and permanent sovereignty. These are things that are very basic principles of international human rights. So it would be great to also include them in the text of the bill in one way or another. And this is not obviously Palestine specific. I think this is relevant to many situations around the world where there's a lot of corporate activities, extractive industries that are infringing on indigenous people's rights, on people's sovereignty over their natural resources, and so on. Your third question was whether it will be helpful for our cases or in our situations. Definitely, I think at least from the perspective of Palestine, we're seeing that there are increasing reports and documentation from civil society organizations and activists around the world, and in Palestine specifically, that are working to unfold and expose the links between multinational corporations, international financial institutions, companies, and the violations that are taking place on the ground. Unfortunately, a lot of these are of European character or nationality. Some of them are based in the Spanish state, as I have mentioned in my presentation as well. And it is not really possible to hold them accountable within the domestic or local accountability systems in Palestine. So ideally, it would be very useful to have such a mechanism to resort to for victims and those affected if they wish. And I think also the added value of the center will not be limited to Catalonia and to addressing corporate impunity in Catalonia and the region. I think it is also a good example that many other local and regional governments could consider copying and doing something similar in the future. So that is also a very significant importance that I see in it. And I think this is it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Abdallah. Ahora el señor Lamin, Mohamed Lamin, si tiene 10 minutos también como mucho. Muchas gracias.
Gracias, presidente. Yo, por mi parte, secundar, ¿no?, lo que ha dicho la compañera Maja. Creo que bueno, el texto es bastante optimista y por nuestra parte, ¿no?, desde la iniciativa, desde la campaña Western Sahara is not for sale, sobre todo nos faltan ejemplos que dar, ¿no?, de buenas prácticas. Creemos que esto va en esta línea, en esta dirección, que por primera vez, ¿no?, un gobierno autonómico pueda tener un parlamento, pueda tener un centro de empresas y derechos humanos que pueda supervisar de alguna forma las prácticas de las empresas catalanas en este caso, pues puede ser un ejemplo al que no intentar presentar para el resto de gobiernos, pero incluso para el mundo. Hasta el momento las violaciones de las empresas han pasado como comentábamos, con la total impunidad, y por lo tanto esto es lo que ha hecho que estas empresas pues cada vez vayan hacia más violaciones, hacia más vulneraciones, porque no hay un castigo y no hay una rendición de cuenta cuando tengo esto. Creo que lo más destacado también en este caso para la ley es que, como ha comentado también Maja, es que cubre básicamente contextos particulares como pueden ser territorios en conflicto o en ocupación, bajo ocupación militar, como es, ¿no?, los dos casos que se han presentado hoy en día. Creo que esto de alguna forma también, ¿no?, reforzará la parte, ¿no?, la base jurídica importante que tienen, por ejemplo, tanto la causa palestina como saharaui, lo que nos toca como causa saharaui. Mencionábamos antes en la intervención y resaltábamos las diferentes resoluciones del Tribunal de Justicia de la Unión Europea, que es la máxima autoridad jurídica dentro de Europa, y que ha fallado en muchas de las ocasiones pues a favor de que estas operaciones ilícitas que se llevan a cabo por parte de incluso la Unión Europea como institución, pero también diversas empresas que no son contrarias a la legalidad internacional y por lo tanto deben cesar de inmediato. Ahora bien, pues los instrumentos vinculantes, ¿no?, y que puedan de alguna manera castigar en el caso de que las empresas hagan lo contrario, serían también ¿no? Una buena práctica para hacer. Por lo tanto, es lo que decía, que vemos que es algo pionero y por lo tanto, por nuestra parte, pues seguiremos también apostando por instrumentos así, y vemos muy favorable que las discusiones y los debates en el Parlamento en Cataluña hayan llegado hasta este nivel, y obviamente esperamos que lo más pronto posible veamos este centro como una realidad que, como comentaba antes, nos va a ayudar muchísimo, incluso en nuestra incidencia, en nuestro trabajo, para que este esfuerzo se pueda duplicar también, ¿no?, en otros contextos. Y nada, muchas gracias de nuevo, y para no tomar tanto, creo que como comentaba antes, todo nuestro respaldo y apoyo, y de nuevo agradecer también la oportunidad para poder explicar nuestras situaciones y poder, ¿no?, acercar nuestros casos y lo que vivimos al Parlamento.
Muchas gracias, señor Mohamed Lamin. Now it's time for Mr. Blackenbach to have the answers about the questions that we have transmitted to you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much to you and to the others that asked questions. I think I would start with the one on whether the center should also provide guidance to companies, right? If I understood correctly, I think what makes this so innovative, I think, is more the ability of the center to do these controls and evaluations, right? I think that's what seems more innovative to me, and what is maybe the biggest added value. But having an additional mandate to also provide or disseminate guidance could be an addition that makes sense. I don't think there is a need to reinvent the wheel when it comes to guidance. There is a lot of guidance material available. Not so sure about materials in Catalan language, so maybe that could be a start. Translating some of the key materials into Catalan, for instance. I think generally companies have a lot of resources they could use, right, including on our website, but also there are these the global compact networks. the UN. I mean, there is good guidance also on the UN guiding principles, like the interpretive guidance. There are the OECD guidances on sectors. There is one general OECD guidance on due diligence. So I think there's a lot of guidance available, and yeah, maybe there is not even a need to develop a lot of new guidance, but maybe it's more about the dissemination, about informing businesses where to get this from, maybe organizing a workshop or so. But from my perspective, that's not what I would focus on with the center. I think the ability to evaluate, assess companies, and do these controls, I think is more, maybe more effective. But yeah, it can be both, I guess. Of course, guidance should not look like, it should not become like a tick box list, you know, where companies have a very detailed list of steps to follow, and when they do all this at a very superficial procedural level, then they will pass the test of the center. So one has to be a bit careful of not decreasing the effectiveness of the center by providing this kind of a tick box list as a guidance. But I think there are smart ways to do this. I think the German authority enforcing the German Supply Chain Act, they also do both in a sense. They do the assessment of companies and monitoring and enforcement of the law, but they also provide guidance to some extent, and they are very careful of not getting into that situation of providing a tick box list for companies that only promotes like a very superficial compliance, and then companies automatically pass the test when they tick all the boxes. So yeah, in short, I think guidance and help for companies could make sense as an additional component. I would just not focus on it, and it has to be done in a smart way, and probably using what is already there in terms of guidance developed by UN, OECD, and others. And I think my response to the certification question is a bit similar. I think there are a lot of certificates already around, and I think the danger with a certificate is always to kind of tick the box, right? I mean, you give the company a certificate, and then it's all done, and everybody, I mean, the company can use that as a fig leaf to show, well, we are totally human rights violation free or so. Certifications are very contested also, because it is almost impossible to certify that a company is free from human rights violation. It's such a dynamic environment, and rather than going for certifications, we encourage company to really constantly do due diligence, assess risks, look into those issues, find the measures to end and prevent those harms and risks. Whereas going for a certification sometimes encourages company to go for the easy solution for like formal compliance, to get the certification, to tick the boxes of the list of criteria, but not really do quality due diligence. I don't know if it's clear, but there is a lot of material, also academic materials on the pitfalls of audits and certifications, and I don't think it's necessarily needed to provide that certification. I think companies can have other incentives. They don't necessarily need a certification. I mean, it is an asset. It is an added value if a company respects human rights. I think it increases. There is a business case for human rights, right, for companies. It increases the long-term business viability. It makes the company more attractive for employees. All these things. It can avoid disruption of projects, especially, for instance, renewable energy projects, right? When companies do not consult with stakeholders properly, then sometimes the project has to stop because there is protest. All these things, I think, make a business case for human rights already. So there may not be a need for extra certification. And then SMEs, yeah, you're right. I mean, the UN guiding principles, for instance, are fully built on the idea of proportionality. So smaller companies typically have smaller human rights impacts, and then they have to do less complex measures, less complex due diligence measures. If it's a very small company that has a big impact, which could also be right, if they are in a high-risk sector mining high-risk minerals, then they would have to do a lot of human rights due diligence measures. But typically, a smaller company will have to do less than, let's say, Mango or so, which I believe is based in Catalonia. Yeah, and it's I mean, there's no one list for a small company, one list for a big company. That is all context specific, right? I mean, that has to be developed. And maybe for that purpose, it can be interesting to bring companies together to exchange experiences on how they implemented it. But generally, it is a scalable concept. I think the important thing is that the measures are serious and adequate and can have an impact and not something superficial or so that is just done to comply. And as I mentioned, like having fair purchasing practices, paying enough for the goods that a company buys from other suppliers, that can already be a measure that is decided at the local level at the headquarters, but can have a big impact globally, because suppliers then don't have to outsource, subcontract, or exploit their employees, their workers. In terms of the legal text as it stands, I think it's quite good. I agree. I would also add a reference maybe to indigenous peoples, human rights defenders, unions potentially. So all these are stakeholders that companies should talk to as part of their due diligence or as part of their efforts to respect human rights. And maybe it's also a group that the center could invite, for instance, for consultations. I think there is already a clause where one member from the Global South is part of the advisory body. I think that can be maybe extended by having more representatives from Global South, including a human rights defender, for instance, or indigenous community representative. As I also mentioned, if there could be something on remedy, that the center also encourages, pushes whatever companies to provide remedy to victims of abuse. I think that would be helpful if it's possible within the legal mandate. And I encourage you to be creative with the legal mandate. So I think that provision of remedy to victims is really key and really under the radar. And I wonder whether a reference to the UN Guiding Principles could be helpful, or a mention of saying that companies should implement or should respect human rights in line with international standards of the UN Guiding Principles, something like this. But yeah, it's up for you to discuss. It's just because the UN Guiding Principles are somehow the authoritative framework that companies usually look at, and that many guidance documents also refer to when it comes to respecting human rights. I think that's it. And as I also mentioned, the UN Guiding Principles are a flexible document, right? They are not a tick box list of things to do superficially, but they really provide a framework, and companies have to be innovative and fill that framework with their own, with life and with context-specific solutions that can really make a difference for the victims and for affected people. But yeah, just this idea whether maybe one could refer to the UN Guiding Principles. I think that would be it from my side. And thanks you again for the invitation.
Thank you to you, Mr. Blackenbach. So we finish the group, the session. Thank you very much, all of you, and see you next time.
Great. See you. Have a good day.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Mahfud. Bye, Johannes.
Donem per acabar la sessió. Ara, si fem un repàs de